So today we'll be talking obviously about the election. It'll be moderated by Dr. Danielle Jostin Martin from the Political Science Department. She studies elections and political behavior. So I'll let her take it away from here.
Thank you, Dr. Halder. Today we are going to have our 2024 election post-mortem what just happened event. And every election year when we do these kinds of events, we plan them in advance. So we have no idea what's going to happen with the election. So we always call it something like what just happened, like today's event. Because there's always something in an election that is unexpected, that we couldn't predict, or that we just didn't expect. And this election wasn't different. So today we have a panel of political scientists who are going to help us put this election in a broader context and give us some perspective, both at the national level, state, and even in a comparative perspective. So today I'm going to introduce three political scientists who will help us parse through this. The first one here is Dr. Wesley Heppy. He's a professor of political science here at Sac State. His research and teaching focus on California government and politics and American political parties. Next, we have Dr. Cristina Flores Victor, an associate professor of political science at Sac State. Dr. Victor's research and teaching focuses on Latinx politics and immigration politics. And finally, we have Dr. Nancy Lapp, a professor of political science at Sac State. Her research and teaching focuses on comparative and international politics, and specifically voting and elections in Latin America. So each panelist is first going to say a few words, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions for our panelists, just save your questions till the very end, and after each has a chance to talk, we'll open it up for Q&A. So first, we're going to start with Dr. Heppy.
We start with a post from X, which used to be called Twitter, after the election. Donald Trump has no greater friend than the far left, which has managed to alienate historic numbers of Latinos, Blacks, Asians, and Jews. In the Democratic Party, with absurdities like defund the police, from the river to sea, or Latinx. There is more to view than there is the game politically on anybody or far left that is more representative of Twitter, Twitch, and TikTok than there is of the very little. The working class is not buying the ivory tower nonsense the far left itself. This comes from Representative Richie Portman's Democrat from New York, representing the Bronx, which is probably the poorest geographical district in the country. And no fan of the far left. And so it's not something that's a right or left division of what happened in the election. There is a lot of anger on the Democratic side too. We could talk more about that later, but we go through some simple numbers at first. Obviously, the president-elect, former President Trump, is winning the election, winning 3 to 12 electoral votes. Slightly less than 50% of the popular vote, but definitely winning the popular vote as well. Republicans pick up 4 seats in the Senate, knocking off 3 Democrat incumbents. And it looks like Republicans are going to lose 1 or 2 seats collectively in the House, but they'll still be a majority barely, which will be interesting if House members resign and change positions in the Trump administration. It'll be interesting what happens there. Donald Trump won all 7 swing states. I will mention them. You all know the names. You heard them over and over in the election. 6 of them pickups in 2020, when he only won in North Carolina. But it's interesting that our vice president did better in those 7 swing states than the rest of the country. A Cook Political report found a 3-point Trump swing from 2020 to 2024 across those 7 battleground states. But among the other 40 states, the swing was almost 7 points. And so if we're going to talk about Harris and the resources put into her campaign, targeting swing states works. Overwhelmingly, the election swung against her, but the places that she and her staff put resources in definitely worked. It just wasn't enough to stop the Trump talk. Where Trump did really well, though, he is in some of the bluest parts of the country. He did slightly better in swing states, and he did slightly better in Republican areas, but he won 10 more points in New York City than he did 4 years ago. Harris wins in New Jersey by only 6 points. Well, Biden won by 16 points in 2020. Miami-Dade County, a very Latino county down in the tip of Florida, voted for Trump by 11 points. Biden won it by 7 points. Hillary Clinton won it by 29 points in 2016. And so there's a lot of places where Donald Trump is doing better. Many of those areas he still lost. Some of them he was able to sweep. But at the same time, 2024 is the fourth election in a row where the popular vote margin was within 5 points. There's only one time in American history that's ever happened before, a series of elections where the popular vote was so close, and we're talking 1876 to 1896, here where the country was equally divided and polarization was at its peak. Donald Trump wins the national popular vote. They said slightly less than a majority, but he wins the national popular vote. But he's only one of 2 presidents to do that since 1988. The other was George W. Bush winning re-election in 2004. But George W. Bush in 2004 is the only Republican in modern times to win a majority of the popular vote. Donald Trump slightly less than that. George W. Bush slightly more than that in 2004. But since 2004, Democrats have won it 3 times. The violent flags and Democrats in 2020. When the Democrats win, they usually win the popular vote, and they win a very scandalous vote on the victory. Republicans are struggling with the national popular vote. We had the second highest turnout in modern times, only surpassed by 2020, but the largest turnout in American history. 9 states had their highest turnout since 1980. But I think one of the things that's really important to talk about here is that our entire notion of the electorate is switched with Donald Trump. Donald Trump relied a lot of things in American politics, but turnout was one of them. Historically, a high turnout helped Democrats. High turnout hurt Republicans. But as we've heard over and over again, Donald Trump is doing very well with working class white voters and reached out very well to working class non-white voters who haven't gone to college or have gone to some college or, I've gone to community college, whatever you want to say, who don't have bachelor's degrees. Those are low propensity voters. Those are people who maybe turn out for the presidency who are really interested in race in their state, in the midterm elections, but don't usually vote. So if Donald Trump is able to continue that coalition with other Republicans, high turnout will help Republicans, and low turnout will help Democrats. And this is largely a realignment of immigration of voters that are highly educated moving to the Democratic Party, and those who don't have a college degree moving to the Republican Party. We haven't seen this in modern times. The massive increase of people who went to college at the end of the 1960s, that's the point the Republican Party had a lot of them who have college degrees. You have people who were in academia, or people who had masters in social work were always going to vote Democrat. You can do that. But that's a very small group of people who have college degrees. Those who did not have a bachelor's degree were Republican. In poll after poll, they showed they were Democrats. Trump wins voters that make in their household less than $50,000 a year, which is one of the first times the Republican has done that in modern time. In contrast, Harris wins voters earning more than $100,000. Trump won those in 2020. Republicans have won them for as long as we in that. There's a switch going on. Wealthier, higher education voters are going one way. Voters who aren't making as much money, don't have a college degree, are going another way. I started off talking about Richard Torres. I will go to the next district over, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. Her district definitely voted Democratic, but it went from 22.77 in 2020 to 33.65 in 2024. A huge increase in the Republican vote. She was so shocked by this, she went on Instagram and asked her voters to message her and tell her who voted for her and Donald Trump and why. He says sometimes you gotta dig in and see it to understand and adapt, even if it makes you want to barf. We're going to hear more about how Latinos have voted differently in earlier elections. I just want to start by saying Ronald Reagan said in 1983, Latinos are Republican, they just don't know it yet. It took a long time for Latinos to become Republican, and they still aren't really. But there's definitely a trajectory going on there. And Donald Trump, of all Republicans, somehow, amazingly, figured out how to unlock it. He wins the election and continues this realignment of American political parties and politics that is just confounding to political scientists. Everything I learned in school and I've studied my whole life is the opposite of what Donald Trump has done. And I think that's really interesting, and I think we should say more about that as time goes on.
All right, thank you, Dr. Murphy. And next we're going to go over to Dr. Victor. Thank you all for coming out, having interest in politics. The first thing I want to start with, and if you ever maybe have been in a class or seen me on a panel, will know that this is always where I start. I'm going to talk a little bit about Latinos, Latinas, turnout, what this means for realignment, their ideological preferences and things like that. But we always have to start with the discussion of this term, Latinos, Latinx, Latine, Hispanics, whatever term we want to use. These are all types of pan-ethnic identifiers that group an incredibly diverse set of people under an umbrella that may be incredibly, I guess, inappropriate for us to group these people together. So when we use a pan-ethnic identifier, it can be very useful to us, I guess, in counting people and thinking about this group having common and similar characteristics or preferences politically. But what it does is it can hide or wash away differences across groups. And by averaging everybody together, we lose that kind of fine-grained nuance to think these are different groups of people. They're different maybe culturally, maybe even in terms of language, in country of origin experiences, when they arrived in the U.S., documented status, new status families. I mean, there's a lot of differences across groups. So sometimes surprises in the election, they're not really surprises. They're only surprises because we've grouped together this group of people that are so diverse, and then when they behave in different ways in certain states or certain areas, we're very surprised by it, right? So I just wanted to start off by saying the pan-ethnic identifier doesn't always help us to understand groups. And the same could be said of Asian Americans, right? That's another very diverse group that gets kind of lumped under this pan-ethnic identifier. So I want to start there. Second, I want to talk a little bit about Latino turnout and preferences across states. As Professor Hussey mentioned, Latinos did different things. Now, having said there's an issue with the pan-ethnic identifier, I'm going to use it, and I'll go back and forth a little bit. In different states, turnout looks different in all of the different swing states. So in Florida, Michigan, and Texas, Latinos do vote in favor of the Republican Party, right? The numbers for the Republican Party are better in those states. In Texas, Democrats only receive 44% of the Latino vote. Republicans receive 55%. In Michigan, this is something that Latino scholars right now are in a huge kerfuffle about. The turnout in Michigan, the initial numbers were that they go 58% Republican and 37% Democrat. Some pollsters have come out and said that cannot be right. That has to be wrong. Those numbers are wrong. We're going to go back through and look at the exit polls and figure out what happened. So we're just going to tell you that Michigan is a point of discussion and debate right now among people who are Latino scholars. In Florida, 58% Republican, 42% Democrat. Each of those states has a different mix of so-called Latinos, right? We know in Florida they have more Cuban and Puerto Rican, but Puerto Ricans largely support the Democratic Party and not the Republican Party. So even in states that have different mixes, they have different preferences too. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, all swing states, all voted in favor of the Democratic Party. Not maybe in large enough numbers to kind of swing the election, but they were very worried about these kind of Latino turnout in these states. The other thing in this election that was really interesting, that's been going on now for many years, if not a couple of decades, is the gender gap between Latinos and Latinas. There's also a gap between college educated and non-college educated. just like in the general population, right, there are preferences across these different indicators. Just as one example, in the aggregate, right, in the entire US, 55% of Latino men voted in favor of Donald Trump, while only 38% of Latinos. That's a really large gap. And in some states, it's even kind of larger. I have a number here, I just lost it real quick. Oh, in Nevada, this is a really critical swing state, right? 38% of Latino men voted for Democrats, right? So in certain states, they do even worse, right, than kind of like the national average. I already mentioned Puerto Ricans are like the most of all the Latino groups, are the most supportive of Harris and the Democratic Party, followed with 65% of Puerto Ricans voting for Harris, 63% of Mexican Americans voting for Harris, and then Cuban Americans, obviously a group that gets talked about a lot in Florida, 54% voting in favor of Trump. So you might be saying, well, okay, there's differences across types of Latinos, there's differences at the state level, but what are the issues that matter a lot to Latinos? Sometimes in popular press and in discussion, I know you've probably seen this before, Latinos get referred to as kind of like immigrants, and all immigrants are Latinos, and they kind of use these terms very interchangeably. Of course, we know that's not true, right? Not all Latinos are very recent immigrants. Not all immigrants are Latinos. But there's this common belief that immigration is always the #1 issue for Latinos. That has almost never been true in presidential elections. There have been some rare circumstances where immigration was the #1 issue. But in this election, the #1 issue for Latino voters was the cost of living and inflation. More than 52% of Latinos polled said that was their #1 issue. The second issue was jobs and the economy. So sometimes when people say, oh, how can Latinos vote for the Republican Party, Trump's saying this and that, because that's not the message they're listening to, right? They're listening for an economic message, whether that's about taxes or jobs or anything else, the price of groceries, the price of eggs, right? I know that's a thing that gets talked about a lot. I don't know how eggs became the indicator for all food, but somehow they did. Gas prices. The third most important issue was housing. Again, you might think of this as another economic indicator, right? The price of housing. And thinking about the places where Latinos live in major cities, right? They're dealing with really high housing costs. Fourth were healthcare costs. Now we're at 4 things that all have to do with like money, right? The cost of like living. Fifth was abortion and reproductive rights. Immigration issues were 6th. So that's pretty far down on a preference list, even though immigration topics were being talked about a lot in the election. It just was not the most salient issue for Latinos. And again, why would it necessarily be, right? Latinos, like I mentioned, not all Latinos are recent immigrants, and not all recent immigrants are Latinos. When we get into the immigration issue, it becomes even more complicated. 70 or 80% of Latinos, when surveyed, say they support providing permanent legal status for undocumented immigrants. That's not a lot higher, it's a bit higher than the general population. When they're asked about DACA or Dreamers, there's always very high kind of consensus that we should provide some sort of legal pathway for especially young people who are brought to the US. But at the same time, 71% of Latinos support the bipartisan border security bill, which would decrease the number of asylum seekers, increase the number of agents, and expand detection. So just like other people who live in the US, they hold these kind of maybe potentially what we might think of as opposing views. On the one hand, they want a crackdown, and they want more agents, and they want more detection. On the other hand, they want a pathway to documentation or for documented status for people already living here. That's the same as other non-Latino groups, right? If you survey or poll kind of whites or Asian Americans or other groups of people, they hold kind of those 2 views at the same time. So even if immigration were very salient for Latinos, which it wasn't in this election, they have conflicting views about it. And Trump's message about beefing up the border and kind of going after people who are here so-called illegally might also appeal to them. One thing I wanted to mention that you brought up, Trump does better with Latinos making over $100,000 a year. So it's a little bit of a flip, right? Latinos who
have been here longer, own businesses and things like that, he does better with. The last thing I want to mention is that for Latinos in general, I would be very wary about exit polling. This has been a source of a lot of disagreement among people trying to nail down what happened in elections. A lot of exit polling is done only in English. So it leaves out Spanish-speaking people. These corrections will come over the next couple months as they kind of dig into the exit poll data. So I would save a lot of analysis, potentially even for the coming months, about how Latinos turned out in the election.
Thank you, Dr. Victor. And finally, finally, we have Dr. Lapp.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to talk about the U.S. at all, actually. I'm here to give some more international context, because one of the things we've noticed is that this has been a bad year for incumbent parties in general, meaning that parties in power have been voted out of office in lots of countries, right? And I'm going to give you some examples and then talk about maybe why, if there are some general trends. So last month in Botswana, the Botswana Democratic Party, which had dominated politics since the country became independent from Britain in 1966, lost its parliamentary majority. And even the incoming leader was somewhat shocked at the lopsided victory. Botswana's neighbor, South Africa, had elections in May, and the African National Congress, which also had been dominating politics since the first post-apartheid election back in 1994, also lost its majority. And skipping to Asia, the Japanese Liberal Democratic Party, which also had dominated politics in that country for decades, lost its majority. In Britain, in July 4th as it would be, the Labour Party swept the Conservative Party out of power with the Conservatives' votes and seats being described by the parliamentary website as lower than at any general election since 1832. In France, in elections that the incumbent president called hoping for greater support, his party came in third. In the first round, I should say, and a right-wing populist group, the National Rally, came in first in the first round. And that is a party that is anti-immigrant and calls for France for the French. At about the same time that the U.S. was voting, Germany's coalition government fell apart, and they will be having new elections early next year. Among the challenges for Germany is the Alternative for Germany, AfD, which apparently is now the second most popular party in Germany, which, if you know German politics, would seem surprising because it is an anti-immigrant right-wing party that opposes immigration and says things like Islam does not belong to Germany, and also denies climate change. So this brings me to populism, and I want to talk a little bit about that, which is not a new phenomenon, and it's not, I do want to caution, it's not an ideology, right? There's right-wing populists, left-wing populists. And since the term means different things to different people, I want to be very specific about how what I'm calling populism. And I'm going to quote Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, their description of populists. And they say, populists are anti-establishment politicians, figures who, claiming to represent the voice of the people, wage war on what they depict as a corrupt and conspiratorial elite. Populists tend to deny the legitimacy of established parties, attacking them as undemocratic and even unpatriotic. They tell voters that the existing system is not really a democracy, but instead has been hijacked, corrupted, or rigged by the elite, and they promise to bury that elite and return power to the people. And so I want to add that since they feel that the people are the source of their power, they typically reject checks on executive power and support strong leadership that claims this direct relationship with the people. So based on this definition, I actually wouldn't call Bernie Sanders a populist. Sorry, Bernie. There I talked about the U.S. A better example would be a former president who seemingly miraculously survived an assassination attempt during his presidential campaign, which helped create an almost messianic view of his mission, who demonized his opponents and made provocative statements such as calling for a former president to be executed, saying that a congresswoman was not worth raping, that he would rather his son be dead than gay, and much more. There was concern that he was politicizing the military and attacking the independence of the judiciary. When he lost his bid for re-election, he claimed it was because of fraud, and his supporters ransacked the Capitol on January 8th, 2023, because of course I'm describing former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. Anyway, so in Latin America, people have noticed that populists tend to be more likely individuals or personalistic. There's plenty of examples, but I'd point out Javier Milei in Argentina, very libertarian, anti-government president, and Nayib Bukele of El Salvador. In Europe, they tend to be more parties, still with leaders, but express themselves more as political parties. And so AfD, this alternative for Germany, is one national rally. In Italy, Brothers of Italy is actually a right-wing party that is governing Italy in a coalition with other right-wing parties. I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, so what might explain this apparent trend? So I'm going to give you sort of the usual suspects of explaining what's going on, why incumbent parties are getting kicked out, and the rise of populism. So two sometimes related things. So first is economics. In the short term, rising inflation and unemployment. For example, in Botswana, unemployment was 28%. But even more so, rising inequality and concentration of income worldwide has fed discontent. And concern is that globalization has led to some groups being permanent economic losers in the global economy. In more performance-based criteria, corruption scandals have often sparked anti-incumbent sentiment. Crime has also been something. I have to mention that in El Salvador, the high murder rate, extremely high murder rate, led to support for Nayib Bukele's incarceration of tens of thousands of people in a state of an exception. Last count was over 80,000 in a country of a little over 6 million. Immigration as well has been a source of support. Again, AfD is anti-immigration, national rally, anti-immigration in many of the European countries that sparked it. And I would say globalization leading to fears that control over national sovereignty is declining and that traditional values are threatened. As one example, the current Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, got a lot of attention with a speech in which she said yes to natural families, no to the LGBT lobby, yes to sexual identity, no to gender ideology, yes to the culture of life, and no to the abyss of death, which was at a rally for Spain's Populist Party, Vox. Okay, so in conclusion, I do want to point out this could be, an interesting coincidence. I've read those who've said the incumbents are getting kicked out, and that's how it goes. And some of these parties I've already mentioned have been in power for a really long time. Even the Conservative Party had been in power in Britain for 14 years. If it's just that people are frustrated with incumbents, it might be a needed correction. However, as Levitsky and Zablat say, when populists win elections, they often assault democratic institutions. And people are dissatisfied with democracy. A Pew Research Center survey of 24 countries done last year found a large majority of respondents support representative democracy, 77%. But they also found that a median of 59% are dissatisfied with how democracy is functioning. 74% think elected officials don't care what people like them think, and 42% say no political party in their country represents their views. And so these frustrations can lead to support for populism and erosion and methods that erode checks on power and damages the legitimacy not just of the specific governments, but could also undermine support for democratic governments. Let me change that. But also could undermine support for democratic governance in general. Okay.
Great. All right, thank you to all three panelists. So now we'll open it up for Q&A. If any questions, we also might get some from Zoom, but we can also start here in the room. Any questions?
Raise your hand if you have a question.
Or are there any questions from our Zoom audience?
This might be a long question, but. So, on LinkedIn, there has been extensive conversation and claims that nationally, white women were more likely to vote for Trump than Harris. Is that true? And did California white women vote similarly? Or are they also more likely to vote for Trump than Harris?
Trump carried white women in 2020 by 11 points. Harris narrowed that gap to 5 points. This is national. So white women still voted for Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. Biden beat Trump by 9 points among white women with college degrees 4 years ago. Harris expanded that advantage to 20 points. So white women with a college degree or more voted for Harris 20 points over Donald Trump. That's one of the few kind of her electoral wins that she had in that election. California is one of the few states that if there were no non-white population, the white population still votes Democratic. So California's kind of an unusual in that case. But those similar kind of trends would be the same in our state as the rest of the country, where white college-educated women are the most supportive of the Democratic Party. And I would say in California, white women voted for Harris over Trump. But in the nation, even though Harris ate into that significantly, still more white women voted for Trump than Harris.
Next question. There is another question. So how does this period reflect the period immediately before World War II?
We need a historian on the panel.
I mean, World War II is a complicated international event that involved, dozens of countries around the planet that had nothing connecting each other. It was in some sense two major theaters of war that just happened to slightly overlap with the nations. In Europe, democracy was under siege in the period of the 1930s. The great economic climate just devastated America as well as European democracies. And there was this struggle between communism and right-wing ideologies, we could say Nazism, fascism, other things that were like, we're the future. And there was a lot of young people who were attracted to both ideological views on the left and right because they saw democracy as failing, as the same thing that you hear now, compromise is selling out, kind of methodically working through problems isn't going to solve things. But I would be kind of hesitant to say this is the same situation. There's no huge global war about to happen, hopefully. But I don't see nations in the same sense as they were right before the outbreak of World War II. Also, World War II broke out in different time periods in different parts of the planet. Japan and China were fighting for years before 1939. And some people think that's the start of World War II. But yeah, I mean, Europe was struggling, the United States was struggling, the planet was struggling in the 1930s. Much worse than it is now, even though there's a lot of economic unrest now. Not even remotely close to how bad it was in the 1930s.
I would say, a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment maybe during that time period too, a lot tied to, I guess what we would call nowadays economic anxiety. It kind of manifested differently in different countries, but anytime there's kind of, as I'm sure you all know, anytime there's kind of an economic downturn, people, politicians, or groups in society are looking for kind of a scapegoat, and oftentimes, especially newly arrived immigrants or immigrants who appear different than a homogeneous population in terms, whether it's language or religion, culture, any of those things that make them stand out, make them potential targets. Just because we might see some of those things, I don't know that it makes this era similar to pre-World War II. I mean, that kind of economic downturn and turning against immigrants, either within a country or kind of in a more global scale, there's been plenty of economic downturns that have led to really harsh sentiment toward immigrants that haven't led to world wars. So I don't think those two things are necessarily correlated in any in any way.
I mean, the era might, and if you don't think about the war necessarily, but there's been a lot of parallels that people would make between the success of would-be authoritarians, right, electing populists, Mussolini and Hitler, thinking that they can control them and thinking that it will, that their kind of politics is normal, and being very concerned that they really will follow through and erode checks and take power. So in terms of the period, there's certainly people that have made sort of comparisons to kind of democratic erosion.
A few more questions, yeah. So we are told that voting is a right, but the founders wanted to limit it because of racism, but also to avoid many of the pitfalls we are seeing now. So if we ignore fears of discriminatory intent or effect, is there any case to be made for limits on voting that require people to be informed about the issues and the candidates?
I mean, one person's informed is another person's control. I would be very scared about some sort of like, hey, I have to prove that I know something before I can vote. The founders and people in that time period who supported democracy did not believe voting was a right but a privilege. In American history, we've kind of moved more towards a right position, voting as rights. But that kind of structure built into our system means that you have to do something to register, even in places like California. So that's moved politically, but there's still this very strong tradition in our country of people have to register. But, you know, California and other states have moved to mail voting, which has worked really well. I mean, one of the drawbacks is it takes forever for California to count all the votes. We're still waiting for some key races here in California, but it means that a lot of people can vote. And, you know, when I was young, I was very dismissive of, like, you can't vote on Tuesday. It's not that big a deal. And then you get married and have kids and have a job. And it's like, oh, there's things actually happening every day of the week. And I'm going to make time for voting, but I can see why some people it might not happen. Letting people have more time to vote, early voting, mail voting, has kind of changed the dynamics greatly. It's increased turnout, but it's also allowed people, you know, time to think about it and talk to others and then make informed decisions. And that's what we want as political scientists, is we want people to make smart decisions. Even if we don't like their decisions, we want them to make decisions that they think are based on kind of thinking things through. But the idea of some kind of panel deciding who's smart enough to vote or not, that's Orwellian, and I think would probably end pretty horrible.
I'm going to just add something here. I'm going to kind of answer the question maybe in a weird way. I think sometimes we allow ourselves debates and discussions about voting and things. We really allow the discussion to be dominated by the presidency election. We're having this discussion, I think, maybe a lot because Trump got elected, and how did that happen, and who likes him, and who doesn't like him, but there's many other elections that happen that day, right? For your senators, for your congresspeople, for your state assembly, for your state senators, for governors. And I don't see a lot of people saying like, oh, I'm so unhappy with how my city council election turned out that we should put limits on voting. You know, we're letting like one election really change like how we are even thinking about voting, you know, like who should be able to vote, and people need to be more informed. I think that in even having that discussion of like, should there be some minimum level, I think one, that really lets us as citizens off the hook and being like, we're so dumb, we just can't be asked to do anything like in terms of civic engagement. It's our duty as citizens to be informed. And I know that can be an uphill battle and people are busy and they have jobs, but that is one of our duties, right, as citizens in voting, is to be more informed. It also lets the parties off the hook. It's the party's job to do outreach to win people's votes, to inform them of their views, to their platform and what's going on. And I'm going to bring that up because Latinos polled, 45% said they were never contacted once during the election, ever. So we're not doing a great job, right, of reaching out to the voters to explain to them why their vote matters, why they should be voting. I do think that the more people we have voting, the more diverse opinions are represented, the more communities are represented. And again, voting is not just about the president. right? That might be a really important office. It has a lot of influence on a lot of things, is kind of a national figurehead, but we do more than just elect presidents in elections. And so I think any kind of like rules about things, we really need to think more broadly about the purpose of elections from all the way in the federal government to the lowest kind of local level. And it's just more complicated, I guess, than that.
Yeah, and it is a good question. I have, there are people in my household who kind of have voiced the same opinion. I just want to say that the U.S. has had this before, has had literacy tests, and they were absolutely used specifically to keep African Americans from voting. So whoever has the power to decide what informed means has the power to decide who votes. And so any kind of control, I think, well, it will infringe on rights to vote. So, so the better plan would be on the informed side, and I second that.
We have a question over here.
Hi. President-elect Donald Trump said that he wants to effectively get rid of the Department of Education. So how do you think that'll affect us here at Sacramento State?
Part of the question would be the amount of money set aside that the DOE runs, would that go away as well, right? So it's a great question. And let's imagine for a second that some of it goes away, right? We're not a huge research university. That's where a lot of that federal money is in research. So there's definitely research that happens here, and there's definitely professors and programs that use federal research that would be hurt by that. Oftentimes they're employing students, which kind of helps slingshot their interest in that field. But a lot of that research is done to help medicine and help defense and help energy. So I imagine that money would still exist. So that's not a big deal for us. One of the things that frightens me about the loss of the Department of Education federally is the money to poor K through 12 school districts, the Title I money, that is essential to really poor areas where states give some money, but this extra federal money really helps the poorest of Americans and helps equalize outcomes by giving more resources to those schools. I have a feeling the same people who want to get rid of the Department of Education are more than happy to allow that money to dry up. But if I was wrong on that, if they were like, no, that's really good, we would just have it run by a different agency and just not be a cabinet level, I would say, okay, there's probably some bureaucratic inconveniences that would cause, but for the most part, it wouldn't be the end of the world. I just have a feeling the idea of getting rid of the Department of Education federally is a way of getting rid of that Title I money. And then maybe a little bit to like, oh, universities are so left, but like, people apply for research all the time, and it's pretty neutral, and it's not anything that's very controversial. So I imagine we would be probably for the most part okay, but a lot of us went to and had department, Title I schools, and that would be devastating to those school districts, and would have an effect on the kinds of students who apply and end up being at Sac State, and that would be a real concern. That's a pipeline of 10, 15 years later, but it would be one that would be felt for years to come.
Potentially another way is, thinking if, Head Start programs and things like that went away, potentially it could impact our students who are entering those fields in education, as teachers or things like that, if there's less kind of federally funded programs, internships, things like that. I think that if everything did, say, go away, I think what would probably happen, though, is many states would scramble to fill the void, which would involve, the legislature having some very painful conversations potentially about where that money would come from, right? If they decided we're not going to let programs like Head Start or after-school programs dry up, the money would have to come from somewhere. And in states that have higher per pupil spending, my guess is in Massachusetts, those students would probably be fine, right? Because there's this value on education in certain places where they spend more. But that money does have to come from somewhere. And a lot of times higher education is given less money at the expense of K through 12. And we could argue about whether that was good or bad, but it's kind of a reality. In a state that has direct democracy, you could potentially also assume that someone might write a proposition to be on the ballot to say, we're going to have bond money, or we're going to have some dedicated revenue stream to fund these programs. Not every state has direct democracy, but potentially could that be maybe a possibility sometime in the future if the department was closed, truly closed, another president didn't revive it. Maybe that is some potential downstream effect, but states would have to pick up the slack. And so in some states, I think that would happen, and in other states, it probably would not.
Okay, we've got kind of two rapid-fire questions from online. One is essentially, why do we insist on calling elections early, even possibly before some of the westernmost states have voted? And what sort of effects does that have? And then why not the popular vote instead of the Electoral College?
Well, they're connected, so it's good they're asked that way. We don't vote for the popular vote, so we're not calling the popular vote early because there isn't the popular vote that determines who wins the election directly. So we're just calling states, and states have finished voting, and then we call them, and then we get electoral votes, and you guys have all been there on election night and seen the tally happen. If we had an election system based on the direct popular vote, we wouldn't call the election until, maybe Alaska and Hawaii would be messed up, but until, the continental 48 states all voted, or a situation where a candidate won so overwhelmingly that even late states wouldn't affect the margin at the end, but it would be a longer night, and it would be a lot longer waiting for the results. Right now, it's still fairly close. We know who's won, even among the popular vote, but we would wait longer. As for the broader sense of why don't we elect because it's in the Constitution. And changing the Constitution of the United States is incredibly difficult and requires an overwhelming supermajority of people. And a political question means both parties have to think it's in their best interest. And I'm pretty sure one party does not think it's in their best interest. And I think it starts with an R, but I can't pronounce it right, so I'll skip that. But there's no way to change the Constitution of the United States unless everyone kind of agrees or overwhelmingly agrees. And we're not going to change it if the Republican Party feels like it gets a benefit or it's scared of doing a direct vote. A direct vote is a very different beast when it comes to voting. It would change the way candidates appeal to voters. It would change California would get a lot more attention, which might be great, which might be us sick of all the attention like other states are. But there's a strong correlation between the popular vote and electoral vote, of course, but it would look different in the campaign. So I'm not necessarily sure that would necessarily be the better outcome. Ideally, it probably is better, but we're not going to change it. And there's not going to be a political movement that's going to succeed in changing it as long as one party thinks it's in their best interest, and they do. And they think it's in their best interest, and it is in their best interest.
I've heard people make some jokes about the only way that's going to happen would be if the Republican Party continuously for many elections won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College. And then we're motivated, right? Like, we're winning the popular vote and losing the Electoral College. Then again, they become...
Democrats would not.
But the Democrats are like, hey, this Electoral
It's
College
working
has
great
been
for
around
us.
forever.
So it's not going to be in either... One party is always going to be disadvantaged by that, right? If they're the ones winning the Electoral College, they have no motivation to change that rule. And it would be... The process of it would probably take decades for all the states to ratify, and it would just be an incredible amount of political capital that would need to be burned with almost no upside to the people burning the political capital. So it probably, I don't mean to be cynical, not in my lifetime, maybe in yours.
No, I'd say even if it's just not being clear with the outcome, the devil that you don't know is, you'd rather have the devil you know, right? And so people know how to campaign with the Electoral College, or think they know how to campaign with the Electoral College. And it would be a whole new thing to do what everybody else pretty much in the world does when they elect their president. So.
Could you talk a little bit about the difference between the Biden coalition and the Harris coalition?
One is larger. All right, the Biden coalition won and the Harris coalition did not. But, you know, as I said, Harris did better than Biden among college-educated white women, and I assume also non-white college-educated women too. But nationally, Harris did, in a 50-50 nation, when we're not talking about the 1970s or 80s when we had huge election swings, Harris did very poorly across the country, losing in heavily blue areas, losing in heavily red areas. As I said, the only thing that was surprising to me is how well she did relative to how well she did horribly around the country in those swing states. Those were the states that she put the most resources in and lost the least amount of Biden votes. But, you know, if she could have replicated that across the country, she still would have lost, but the popular vote would have been slightly different. I mean, you're going to hear a lot over the next 4 or longer years about the economy, and I think it's a really good point. Every president other than Biden who had a worse inflation lost. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter. I mean, Richard Nixon didn't lose, but it didn't end well for Richard Nixon. You know, every other president since World War II has had better inflation numbers than Joe Biden. And we definitely equate the vice president of Joe Biden with the Joe Biden administration, and Harris was stuck. She couldn't run away from it. So I think that's going to be a major factor in the election. When the economy is the number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 indicators, people are going to vote on the economy. And whether we know for sure that voting for one candidate is going to make the economy better, we know that's not the case, but that's not how people vote. They're upset about the economy, and they thought things were better under Donald Trump, and they're like, I should go for that again. And they did. And it was a swing of several million votes, but we're a massive country. A lot of people are like, I'm not going to do better under Donald Trump, and I'm not going to vote for him. But there were fewer of them. And so in a 50-50 nation, when you win 51-49 or 59-47, that's ultimately the story. You know, Joe Biden wasn't going to win if he had stayed on the ticket. And so Harris kind of was stuck in a very difficult situation, and I think she did the best she could and raised tons of money, and that money seemed to have actually made a difference in swing states. It just wasn't, she couldn't raise $50 trillion to help her win. It wouldn't have mattered, but she definitely kept down the Trump vote in those swing states. It just everywhere else, it collapsed for her.
I think something to remember too is, like, we will analyze this election to death, I'm sure, but she had a much shorter campaign cycle. And so I think we need to always kind of remember that context of she came in not through a typical primary system where she would have had a longer, so maybe the coalition would have looked different, right? If she had had a year to campaign, maybe things would have looked different in Michigan, right, for her. So I think we should always be a little bit careful when we say, you know, what could have been if she had been in longer. Would it have given her more momentum, or would it have died off? It's hard to say, right? But it was a very unusual election cycle, especially for the Harris campaign. Raised a tremendous amount of money, did a lot of on-the-ground outreach to people, and the numbers are what they are, right? But I do think, given a more traditional election cycle, potentially it would have looked really different too.
So this question may be sort of a surprise question for Professor Martin. Sorry to put you on the spot, but what happened with the polls?
Oh, wow. I think Professor Nalder asked this because she knows that Professor Hussey really wanted to talk about it. But, well, the polls, I mean, they basically were within the margin of error if you're thinking just about the popular vote, right? So there are some just kind of structural things that you have to be thinking about in terms of polling that make it really challenging to predict who is going to win, right? So to predict who's going to win, you want to know who they eventually want to vote for, right? Which candidate. But the thing that you really need to know is who the likely voters are. And predicting who a likely voter is particularly challenging, and the pollsters have found it especially challenging when Trump is on the ballot. So they historically in recent elections have gotten it more wrong, I guess, in 2016, 2020, and 2024, every time he's on the ballot. It was really accurate in 2022 midterms elections, right, when he wasn't. And so
Maybe there is something in particular about Trump being on the ballot. So Trump supporters are more likely inconsistent voters, so it's especially challenging to figure out, are they going to vote or not? Are they likely voters? Trump supporters are also more suspicious of institutions, and the pollsters are parts of institutions, media and universities, and so they might just not be answering those polls anyway, right? So if you can't reach the people who are supporting Trump, you're automatically going to underestimate his support. So there are also people talk about a shy Trump voter as well. I'm less convinced by that one, but that also is potentially out there as well. So it's a challenging situation just to reach potential likely voters, even if you can figure out or define how you want to figure out who is likely to actually turn out on election day. That's my quick sum. Professor Hesse, did you have something to add to it, though?
I mean, the whole scientific basis of polling is to randomly connect to the people in this country and take a representative sample. And you do that through phone dialing or through addresses, and we don't do that anymore. People don't answer their phones. People have switched from phones to cell phones. Going house to house is super expensive. So we create pseudo-scientific polling. We get samples of people that we think are representative, and then we ask them questions, and then we fidget with those numbers and adjust them, and then readjust them, and then, oh, this other poll was off, so we should be a little bit more. I don't believe in the scientific nature of polling at all anymore, even though I think that for the large part it's not that off. But the other thing that Professor Martin said is exactly true, is we're really close in elections now. So any margin of error is going to have to include being wrong because it's within the margin of error. And so the only way to reduce that margin of error is to get more samples, which requires a lot more money. And I think, honestly, polling should increase its size to decrease that margin of error if we're going to have a bunch of 50-50 elections. Otherwise, it's completely wrong. And the larger sense of whether it's doing it scientifically or not is kind of above my pay grade. I'll let behaviorists and pollsters worry about that. But I'm very suspicious of polls. And I think all the things Professor Martin said is exactly true about Trump voters, but I just feel like in today's time we over-rely on them. And I mean that as consumers of news. We read them, we like aggregate them. We're like, oh, there's a 70% chance because of, like, no. Elections are going to be very close. The two parties have these huge coalitions that are at the knife edge. They've polarized every single aspect of society. We're right, they're wrong. We're good, they're evil. So we're going to churn out our base. They're going to churn out their base. And if a poll has a 3 or 4% margin of error, every election's within that margin of error. And so that's not so helpful. And we need to move beyond thinking about polls and either revamp them or just kind of, do your ground game, do your digital ad campaign, and get ready for the election and not worry so much about, the horse race. As for like breaking down the vote polling, that can be very useful. What are things that are working with voters? What are demographic groups? But it's kind of like, oh, who 48 to 46 with a 4% margin of error? Okay, so it's a tie. That's what we know, and that's what it ended up being. It was a tie slightly for one candidate or another.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up our election post-mortem event. Thank you all so much for being here in person and online, and thank you especially to our panelists. Thank you. Thank you.
Also, this event will be available online on the websites for the Center for California Studies and the Project for an Informed Electorate if you want to share it with anybody else who you think might be interested to watch it later. Thanks again.